Decision podcasts by the New York Prosecutors Training Institute are made possible by Resemble AI. Convert your text to voice at resemble.ai. Find this and other decisions at NYPTI Law. www.nypti.org/law.
People v. TP, decided on June 17, 2025. Halligan, J. The defendant was tried and convicted of first-degree manslaughter for stabbing her boyfriend, which resulted in his death. At trial, the defendant pursued a justification defense under Penal Law 35.15. She claimed that the victim had severely physically abused her over the course of their relationship, and that she stabbed him during the course of a violent attack. The defendant asserts that her trial counsel provided ineffective assistance for failing to object to remarks that the prosecutor made during summation which misrepresented critical evidence and repeatedly denigrated the defendant. We agree, and therefore reverse. 1. In 2017, the defendant met the victim and began a romantic relationship with him. The relationship quickly became abusive. At trial, several witnesses, including the defendant and several of her friends, testified that the victim had physically abused the defendant numerous times over the course of their relationship. That abuse, which occurred in both public and private settings, was severe, and included witness reports that the victim had strangled the defendant multiple times. After one public episode, an order of protection was issued against the victim in the defendant's favor. It was one such abusive episode which ultimately led to the victim's death in 2018. After spending an evening with several friends, the defendant returned to one friend's house with the victim and others. She testified that, after laying down in a back room with one of her friends, the victim began to forcibly perform oral sex on her and ultimately raped her. When she pushed the victim off, he became violent and strangled her until she was able to break free and run to another room in the house. The fighting continued. The defendant testified that she picked up a kitchen knife that was nearby, and, fearing for her life, stabbed the victim once as he lunged at her. The victim died several hours later. The defendant was indicted in Supreme Court, Erie County on one count of manslaughter in the first degree, see Penal Law 125.20, 1. At trial, defense counsel pursued a defense of justification. As codified at Penal Law 35.15, a justification defense excuses a defendant's use of deadly physical force when a defendant reasonably believes that such other person is using or about to use deadly physical force. Penal Law 35.15, 2a. Defense counsel requested that the trial court issue jury instructions on a justification defense as it relates to the use of deadly physical force, and the trial court did so. During summation, the prosecutor sought to undermine the defendant's justification defense by suggesting that the defendant was not credible. In furtherance of that strategy, the prosecutor told the jury, "You never heard testimony that the defendant was in fear for her life. You never heard testimony that she was in fear of serious injury. Nothing." As the people concede, this statement was false. The defendant had, in fact, testified that immediately before the stabbing she was scared for my life, and when subsequently asked whether she had testified that she was afraid for your life, the defendant responded, "Yes, I was." Additionally, the prosecutor claimed in summation that the defendant had lied on the stand, using the word lie or lies 14 times in total. Among other comments, the prosecutor claimed that the only thing we can get out of the defendant are lies, that her testimony was unsubstantiated wild lies, and that her testimony was meant to distract you from the endless lies she has told you throughout this entire process. The prosecutor also posed rhetorical questions along similar lines to the jury. How could you possibly believe one thing that comes out of her mouth after all the lies she told you? And what wouldn't she lie about? Following summations, the court excused the jury and expressed concern about the repeated use of the word lies, which I also was going to limit if not eliminate, but noted that it did not do so as the word had been used throughout the trial without objection and I didn't think it was proper for me to do it at this point. Defense counsel did not object either to the prosecutor's flat misstatement of the defendant's testimony that she feared for her life or to the repeated use of the word lies. Although defense counsel did make 2 objections during summation, neither were related to these comments, and both were overruled. The jury found the defendant guilty. On appeal, the defendant argued, as relevant here, that the prosecutor's improper remarks during summation deprived her of a fair trial and required reversal. The appellate division affirmed, holding that the issue was unpreserved and that trial counsel had not provided ineffective assistance by failing to object to those remarks. As to the remarks during summation, the appellate division held they did not deny the defendant a fair trial, especially given the court's instructions to the jurors that their recollection of testimony would control. The appellate division reversed Supreme Court's denial of the defendant's motion for sentencing relief under the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act, DVSJA, see Penal Law 60.12, and reduced the defendant's sentence to a term of 4 years of imprisonment with 2.5 years of post-release supervision. 2. Before us, the defendant argues that trial counsel's failure to object to the conceded misstatement of the defendant's testimony and the repeated use of the word lies amounts to ineffective assistance of counsel. Under New York law, a defendant has received ineffective assistance of counsel when errors in counsel's performance amount to a denial of meaningful representation, People v. Caban. This standard focuses on the fairness of the proceedings as a whole, People v. Stultz, and considers the circumstances of a particular case, viewed in totality and as of the time of the representation, People v. Baldi. We must determine whether counsel's performance was consistent with strategic decisions of a reasonably competent attorney, People v. Benevento, citing People v. Satterfield, and whether counsel's performance effectively deprived a defendant of a fair trial, Benevento, citing People v. Flores. We conclude that counsel's failure to object to multiple improper statements constituted a failure to provide meaningful representation, and under the circumstances of this case, denied the defendant the benefit of a fair trial. Although we have recognized that during summation, counsel is permitted to comment upon every pertinent matter of fact bearing upon the questions the jury have to decide, summation is not an unbridled debate in which the restraints imposed at trial are cast aside so that counsel may employ all the rhetorical devices at their command, People v. Ashwall, quoting Williams v. Brooklyn L. R. Co. The well-defined limits on comments during summation require that counsel stay within the four corners of the evidence, quoting Williams, and not make comments that misrepresent or are contrary to the evidence, People v. Wright. A prosecutor may not express his or her personal belief or opinion as to the truth or falsity of any testimony or evidence, People v. Bailey, see also United States v. Young, and must avoid resorting to name-calling, such as stating, during the summation that the defendant and their lawyer are liars, People v. Shannis. Several of the prosecutor's comments during summation were clearly impermissible. First, by admonishing the jury that they had never heard testimony that, the defendant, was in fear for her life, and that they had never heard testimony that she was in fear of serious injury, the prosecutor directly contradicted the defendant's sworn testimony. This misrepresentation of the record well exceeds the bounds of permissible commentary on the evidence, Ashwall, Wright, and indeed, contradicts the crux of the defendant's justification defense, see Penal Law 35.15, 2a. Likewise, the prosecutor's repeated assertions that all of the defendant's trial testimony was lies, as well as his rhetorical question of what wouldn't she lie about? Impermissibly advance the prosecutor's belief that the defendant's testimony was false, see Bailey, remarked during examination that I submit to you, you're telling a bald-faced lie right now held improper, People v. Shannis, see also People v. Fiore. We additionally note that the prosecutor acted improperly on summation in denigrating the defense, vouching for the credibility of the people's witnesses and calling defendant a liar. To be sure, the people have a right to comment on the evidence, including, as relevant here, the defendant's prior inconsistent statements concerning the night of the victim's death and her claim that she had previously lied in making such statements. However, a number of the remarks, including the prosecutor's assertion that the jury could not possibly believe one thing the defendant says, exceeded simply commenting on the defendant's inconsistent statements. Rather, such remarks are more fairly characterized as expressing the prosecutor's personal belief or opinion as to the truth or falsity of the defendant's testimony in its entirety, Bailey. Under these circumstances, given the numerous and repeated improper statements made by the prosecutor during summation, We hold that trial counsel provided ineffective assistance for failing to object to the prosecutor's summation remarks. Where defense counsel fails to object when faced with a pattern of prosecutorial misstatements, such as statements that misrepresent evidence central to the determination of guilt, and where there is no apparent strategic explanation for defense counsel's silence, defendant has been deprived of meaningful representation, right? The mischaracterization of the defendant's testimony about her fear of the victim went to the heart of her justification defense, and the accusations of repeated lies further undermined her credibility in the jury's eyes. Although the trial court properly instructed the jury that attorney remarks made during summations were not evidence, in such a highly charged, potentially outcome-determinative context, People v. Fisher, such an instruction was insufficient to cure the effect of the prosecutor's comments in this case. As such, trial counsel's failure to object to these comments led to the jury receiving an incorrect and inflammatory view of the evidence in summation, which ultimately tainted the fairness of the proceedings as a whole. Stultz. Given our ruling, we need not consider the defendant's challenges to several other alleged misstatements in the prosecution's summation, or the defendant's contention that, under our precedent in People v. Getz and People v. Wesley, it was ineffective assistance for trial counsel to fail to request a jury charge which included an addendum to the New York Model Criminal Jury Instructions. Accordingly, the order of the appellate division should be reversed and a new trial ordered. Order reversed and a new trial ordered. Opinion by Judge Halligan. Chief Judge Wilson and Judges Garcia, Singas, Canataro and Troutman concur, Judge Garcia in a concurring opinion. Judge Rivera concurs in result in an opinion. Decided June 17, 2025.
Decision podcasts by the New York Prosecutors Training Institute are made possible by Resemble AI. Convert your text to voice at resemble.ai. Find this and other decisions at NYPTI Law. www.nypti.org/law